Hello, this is Mark Tooley, president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy, here in downtown Washington, D.C., with the pleasure today of talking to the authors of an important new book, The Christian Roots of American Liberty by Dylan Pahman and John Pinheiro. And I'm probably mispronouncing both of your names, so you're welcome to correct me. But John and Dylan, thank you so much for your availability and for doing this timely book. Please tell us, first of all, although I guess the question almost answers itself, why did you write this book?
That's a great question. So first of all, I think you got our names right. At least
Yeah,
you got mine
you
right.
did.
So
Thank you.
good job on that. So this book actually comes out of a conference panel that Acton organized a few years ago. I think it was maybe 2022 at this point for the Intercollegiate Studies Institute conference. And the idea of the panel was liberty before liberalism. And so we we're going to have one person. I was going to do the ancient period. Then we're going to have someone else do medieval and someone else do modern. And then last minute, the other two people canceled. We did get one replacement to kind of do the modern founding era. But I was on the hook for ancient and medieval. So I wrote a paper trying to show, because already then, and really since about 2016, there's been this kind of rise of Christian perspectives on liberalism and on the American founding that are very different than the traditional kind of fusionist conservative understanding of things. And basically, the idea that one way or another, they have different views and different reasons. One way or another, either the American founding was liberal and bad, or it was Christian and therefore not liberal. Liberal, I'm using this, of course, in the classical liberal sense. And really, anyone who's familiar with the sources knows that it's actually kind of both. And so we wanted to really help people improve their familiarity by not only publishing this paper as introductions to our five sections, but also in these sections, it's a reader. So every single section has ancient, medieval, and modern sources included in it, all the way up to the American founding, so that people can see that the ideas of religious liberty, private property, natural law, limited government, all of these have this long Christian pedigree. And so that we really think with books like, Patrick Deneen's Why Liberalism Failed, or Adrian Vermeule's, Common Good Constitutionalism, or Yoram Hazony's, Virtue of Nationalism. We needed a counterpoint to it that wasn't just here's why we don't like these guys. We do like them. They're, as far as I know, nice people. But we do think they're very mistaken in the historical narrative. And that understanding that really shows that there's more of an option than simply, are you Christian or are you liberal? Are you, pro the American founding, or are you, some kind of progressive or something like that? That it's a bit more complicated, and so we wanted to show that in one book.
John, anything to add?
Only that Dylan is a theologian and I'm an historian, and that's also the way we approach this. There's a great historical case to be made for the very long pedigree of the ideas that I would still argue came together in a distinct way in the founding. And if somebody wanted to argue that was providential, I wouldn't necessarily argue against them, or that it was even exceptional. I might not argue against that. But one of the things the discipline of history does is help us learn to deal with complexity. And the truth is usually more complex than we think it is. There might be scientific laws that the simple answer is always the best answer, but when we're trying to make sense of the big stew pot of the American founding, there's some complexities there that are worth teasing out, as Dylan commented.
Now, Dylan referenced this obviously, but there are post liberal Christians, especially Catholic integralists, who would say the founding of America was poisoned from the start because it was quote unquote liberal. And then we have their Protestant equivalents, sometimes calling themselves Christian nationalists, who embrace America's founding, but insisting it was not liberal and that the founders actually hoped that state established churches would continue, et cetera, et cetera. How do you address these different perspectives? And they're both wrong, but in different ways. How so?
Yeah, so that's right. I guess I could start with the Catholic integralists, perhaps. So the purpose of this book, as Dylan said, was to let the sources argue for themselves, although we have introductions for every section to kind of guide the reader, and we also have a large introduction. But when it comes to the integralists, they look at the American founding and say it was rotten from the start, hopelessly liberal because it was birthed of secular Enlightenment ideas. And so the way to make a counterpoint to that, there's two ways really. We could look at post-liberal regimes as they have actually existed in the world and not just in theory. And Acton Institute will be publishing a book on that this summer. But the other way would be to trace these ideas back to not just pre-Enlightenment sources, not just pre-Reformation sources, but we go all the way back to the early church fathers. And if we wanted to, we could start digging into the Old Testament. We could dig into the Hebrew scriptures to look for protection of private property, for instance. But there's a lot of early church fathers in this book, a lot of medieval texts, things that belong to all Christians, prior to the Reformation. And so with the integralists, we want to show that the ideas that they argue are liberal and to be condemned. In fact, not only are not, but there's this long stream of this kind of thinking in the Catholic tradition. And what we don't say is that, look, this has been the major way that Catholics have thought about religious liberty, say, or private property for centuries and centuries. But there's a clear tradition there. And we see it in Thomas Aquinas. We see it in medieval canons of the church that we cite in here. We see it in medieval councils of the church that determined how elections would take place. We have a very interesting, I thought it was a very interesting source. I'm the one who found this and was excited about it, but it was the Dominican constitutions from the 1300s and 1200s, some of the earliest constitutions of how they would elect their leaders and just how the representation would work. It's very interesting, and it's 800 years old, and none of those guys would have thought they were liberals in the way that term is caricatured, say, by the neo-integralists.
And
Yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Dylan.
Sorry, go. I was just going to try to address the other question of the kind of the Christian nationalist perspective. So the way we address that is partly, I've read, we didn't deal with Stephen Wolfe's book in the introductions, but I have read it, and I do know he appeals a lot to kind of the magisterial Reformation, and so it's a short reader. We didn't want to be a massive tome that nobody's really going to read. So we have just a few, but we have four sources from that period. Sebastian Castellio and Matthew Hale, and some others, Melanchthon, for example, and Hemmingson, another Lutheran, to show that like these actually have these ideas, natural law, religious liberty, these have roots that go back private property as well. Matthew Hale has the exact same argument for private property as does, say, John Locke, for example, that by combining your labor with the commons, something becomes yours. And to show that like there's this Christian heritage, even a Protestant Christian heritage, for these ideas. And yes, you do have a varying degree in colonial America of religious tolerance. And we included some examples of that. The Pennsylvania Constitution or ordinance, I can't remember the official title of it, as well as the Maryland Toleration Act. And John actually just had an essay published today in the Reading Wheel Review talking about the wide variety of reasons why people wanted disestablishment. It wasn't always that they loved religious liberty. Sometimes it was they didn't want a national church so they could have their own established state church. And so, the Christian nationalists, they kind of grasp onto that and they try to say, well, see, we should be able to impose, our specific Protestant denominational view on everyone. And the reality is that even the Protestants tended to be at least tolerant of each other. But also by, I'd say about 1820, basically every state has disestablished. They haven't stopped being Christians, but they've realized that, hey, there's some great wisdom in this. That when you have this kind of freedom of competition in religion, then it's just about being the better church, right? And showing that your church is more beneficial to the common good. So we document that, again, going all the way up until the First Amendment, to really kind of give a counterpoint that again that it seems like, they're bringing forward this tradition, but it's really kind of this cherry-picked sort of thing. And I will say just one last comment. Our point is not to say, of course, that the only Christian view is a view that's pro-liberty. We think it's the best, truest, most faithful Christian view. But of course, in Christian history, there's been all sorts of varying degrees of tolerance of other religions, of other Christians, different degrees of, state encroachment in power or, checks on state power, that sort of thing. But the point is that this idea of liberty does have Christian roots, and that's what's missing. People have been talking about, those real kind of illiberal sources at the exclusion of another just as Christian tradition of liberty. And that's what we wanted to give a voice to.
And I suppose the national conservatism perspective on this, it tries to acclaim the Constitution, but minimize the Declaration of Independence as more liberal and Enlightenment influence. So, how do you deal with that perspective?
Yeah, so Hazoni really interestingly, because he's actually an Orthodox Jew, he argues that Christian or that America is kind of foundationally Protestant, and so he actually, even though he's not a Christian nationalist, he tends to make some kind of similar arguments. I think a little bit more sophisticated than Wolf, but some similar sort of things. He reaches back. He has his kind of own tradition of conservatism. He mentions people like John Fortescue and Matthew Hale. We have both of them in our book. They say the opposite of what Hazoni says they say. And it's the sort of thing that I think a lot of readers reading books, by Deneen or Hazoni or Vermeule, they're non-specialists. Most people in the world are not paid to be researchers like us. And so they're kind of just taking their word for it. And we wanted people to be able to really know those sources because when he says things like, the basis of consent as a basis for a just society, that's a Enlightenment liberal idea. Well, it's not. It's an idea endorsed by John Fortescue. In fact, he distinguishes between, a royal society and a royal and political society. The latter, all the laws are subject to the consent of the people, and that's what he thinks is the most just. So it's literally the opposite opinion that he attributes to him, but he's still kind of marshaling these names in his favor. And I think you see that in a lot of these different perspectives. They don't all agree with each other, obviously. Catholic integralists and Protestants don't really get along, but they do agree in this weird sort of telling of history, whether it's favoring their tradition of the opposition of others. And we really just wanted to put the lie to that, just to show that look, let's read the sources ourselves. And the sources aren't always saying exactly the same thing, but that's, hopefully how a good reader works, that you get exposed to these sources. And now you can kind of decide, oh, I like Lactantius a little better than John Locke when it comes to religious liberty. But you still see that both of them are making a similar sort of case.
Yeah, I would add to what Dylan has just said that we have one whole section in here on limited government. And so when it comes to folks like the Christian nationalists and the national conservatives, I meant, when it comes to the national conservatives, for instance, we're not talking about conservatives who think the idea of limited government is something to conserve, that it is one of the core principles of the founding, but rather we have those who are flirting with state capitalism for nationalist reasons. And so this is not a reader all about religious liberty. It's about several of those core principles of liberty. But one important one of those, of course, is limited government, because that grows out of the sinfulness of the human person. Whatever any particular Christian thinks about the degree to which we are sinful, there's one thing we know, especially if we look inward, that we're not perfect. We tend to abuse power. And so we have in here the Magna Carta, for instance, and a number of sources over the years that show a development in thinking of why government needs to be limited, what the church does that the state can't do, and vice versa, what the individual's role is in that, what society's role is. And as Dylan said, you see it in the sources. You see a development of thinking. Tertullian's talking about religious liberty. It looks a lot like what Thomas Jefferson is saying about religious liberty. We know Jefferson certainly was not an Orthodox Christian, and yet there's this great similarity there. But that doesn't mean Jefferson woke up one day and read Tertullian. This is the fruit of centuries of intellectual and moral development.
And neither of you is an evangelical, I believe, but both of you are familiar with a subculture within evangelicalism that's produced a lot of literature about America's Christian founding that often exaggerates the amount of piety in early America and tries to insist the founding fathers were listening very closely to their pastors, et cetera, et cetera. How does your book interact with that perspective, if at all?
Oh, we do address that. So, yeah, there was a book by Mark David Hall kind of recently that makes that case, and I think he's very well intended. I think he makes a much better case than kind of the Christian nationalist perspective. That's not his view, but there's a few issues. I think he misunderstands deism. So in the 18th century, to be a deist didn't mean that you thought that God pushed the first domino and then crossed his arms and the cosmos is just going on its own. What it meant is that you denied that God ever works supernaturally. So deists denied miracles, they denied revelation, like the scriptures, right? But they believed in providence. And you see that in Thomas Jefferson, who actually was a deist, and not really, as John said, not in any way an Orthodox Christian. Um, but at the same time, so that I think his accounting of how many of the founders were really Christians, I think he's kind of misunderstanding because he says, well, this guy affirmed providence, therefore he must be not a deist. That doesn't actually tell you anything. But the other side of that is, Tertullian, or sorry, Jefferson didn't just wake up one day and read Tertullian, but we do know that in this case, he actually did read Tertullian because I can't remember who it is. I keep forgetting that. Is it Wilkin, his book?
Yeah,
But
Robert Louis Wilkins'
yeah, he
book.
has this
Sure.
great
Yeah.
appendix on Jefferson and Tertullian that he looked at Jefferson's library. Jefferson did own Tertullian's
Mhm.
apology and his letter to Scapula, both of which there's selections of in our reader. And the argument that Tertullian makes for religious liberty, matches Jefferson. So in this case, not in every case, but in this case, it is the exact same sort of argument that you see in the Virginia Statute of Religious Liberty and religious freedom. And so, there's other cases where it's more, we think it's kind of genealogical, right? So, like the Edict of Milan, maybe they read it, maybe they didn't, but it is something that is the fruit of Christian reflection in those first centuries when Christians were being persecuted again and again and again. They're not arguing for, okay, the emperor should become a Christian and force Christianity on everyone. They're just saying, stop killing us, tolerate us, treat us like everyone else. There's this weird irony in ancient Rome that it was actually a fairly religiously tolerant society if you could demonstrate the antiquity of your religion. But they looked at Christianity as a new cult, and so Christians were persecuted. And so you have this effort, Christian lawyers and rhetoricians and philosophers for centuries trying to prove that Christianity is in continuity with ancient, Hebrew texts and religion, but also then arguing for just the good of religious liberty. And in fact, Jefferson may have even coined the term. That was pointed out in a review of our book that came out today, religious liberty. And so it's something that, the church has a very fraught history with, but it has this tradition. And it's something that you see the fruit of it, I think, in the American founding and in the First Amendment, in really just the American Constitution, not in the purely written sense, but in the kind of spiritual sense of what makes for the health of our nation. This has been one of the bedrocks from the very beginning. And it's something that grew out of Christian soil.
I think Jefferson, even in his book about Tertullian, even underlined the language that Tertullian
Yes.
used.
Yeah, yeah.
So pretty direct line there. The John Locke, who is often demonized as the founding demon of liberalism and therefore must be dismissed from the founding or used to disdain the founding. How do you deal with John Locke?
I can start again
I
with
know
this
you did all the
one.
work on Locke, Dylan, so I'll let you keep
Yeah.
going.
So I mean, John Locke again is one of these guys that he is a Enlightenment philosopher. He doesn't always care about having a perfectly orthodox theology, But he's not a deist in this case. So he believes in miracles. He believes in scripture, revelation. So that's important to start off. But what we really do is we put him in context with, he's often just read, people read his two treatises, maybe even just excerpts from it, as if he were just some guy sitting around in an ivory tower saying, I've got an idea. What if everybody has a social contract? When in reality, his two treatises are a response to another work, Robert Filmer's Patriarcha. And we actually give the first few pages of Patriarcha because it's pretty clear when you read those pages what John Locke is trying to do. Robert Filmer wrote this book about the divine right of kings, and he begins by prefacing it and saying, there's this really crazy bad idea going around that all people are by nature equal and that the only just laws are those that they assent to. The papists, so the Roman Catholics, they bought into this. The Reformed, like the Calvinists, many people in the Church of England at the time would have been Reformed. They've bought into this, and the common people, and it goes all the way back to the schoolmen, like the scholastics. But then he says, but you won't find it in the Bible or the Church Fathers or according to natural law. And then you read Locke's two treatises, and he is constantly quoting the Bible and appealing to natural law. He doesn't really do a great job appealing to the church fathers, but we kind of do that for him with some of our readings. But everything else, you see that, oh, this is a guy who actually is standing in continuity with a tradition of Christian political philosophy. Again, his theology, not so traditional, his epistemology, metaphysics, we could get into all that. But when it comes to his political philosophy, especially when you do look at some of those sources, those medieval or early modern sources like Richard Hooker, and we include, not Hooker, maybe we should have, but we include some other similar sort of sources like Matthew Hale, you see that, like these things that are often attributed to Locke, the social contract, the origin of property, as some idea that he came up with, and then the American founders, ended up running with it. These were not new ideas. This is like the least original part of his thought. And again, you can actually see that by reading the sources for yourself in our book.
John, what do you hope the average reader takes away from your book?
I hope the average reader, be they an evangelical Protestant, part of the Reformed tradition, Catholic, Orthodox, the average reader should take a look at this and realize that the United States might have been it was a Christian country, if by that you mean a country of Christians, of churchgoers, depending on who you're talking about, with a very long pedigree in Western civilization of their ideas. And as those coalesced, we don't want to mistake their ideas, particularly of religious liberty, for something that was a purely secular idea and just based on fear of, say, religious warfare, or the idea that we can't know the truth, so just make everything legal. This is a recognition of the fact, as that Virginia statute says, that God created our minds free. You can't coerce belief, etc. And so they realize that. And I think especially for evangelical readers, to even return to your previous question, Mark, when we look at the history of the United States, those evangelical denominations really took off in the 1820s and 30s, right? And so the time period we're talking about is the time period that Michael Novak talks about in his book, Washington's God, where he's saying this is Washington's God, and it's clearly the God of the Bible, but why doesn't he talk about it all the time? Well, because not only is he not a 19th century evangelical, he's not a 20th or 21st century evangelical either. And that's just not how these folks talk. Now, Jefferson and Adams are very different in their correspondence. It gets kind of weird and theoretical and highly philosophical about religion. But an interesting thing you can see in this book is that when Washington wrote to the Jewish synagogue, and we have that letter actually on the cover of the book, he's saying that this is our liberal policy, he calls it, is worthy of imitation by all. In other words, this is not just an American thing. It's not just an Anglo-Saxon thing. It's worthy of imitation because it's a liberal policy that recognizes the freedom of the human person. And he's telling this to a particular synagogue. And so I think if you take anything away from this book, it's that if there's any exceptionalism here, it's an exceptionalism deeply rooted in history that maybe providentially came together, but that's not the same as saying America was founded as a Christian nation or that it was founded as a horribly secular nation. Again, it's complex. Our minds are created to seek and know the truth, and that's what we want folks to do is apply their mind to this. And I think those questions at the end of every chapter that we provide can help that. Read the sources for yourself.
John or Dylan, do either of you have a copy of the book within reach that you could hold up?
Yes.
I do.
Okay.
Yeah, we both do. Look at that.
Excellent.
And I want to point out, not only do we have like the letter of Washington in the background, but because it's his letter, every single book is signed by George Washington, the first president of the
Yes.
United States. So how about that?
And King Charles said Americans should read the Magna Carta, so we feel like that's an endorsement of our book as well, since it's in there.
By extension, absolutely. The Christian Roots of American Liberty by Dylan Pahman and John Pinheiro. Thank you very much for a very informative conversation.
Thank you,
Thanks
Mark.
for having us.